All set.
Thank you very much for your support. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Westhill parents and families. And welcome to Making the Grade.
Muy buenas noches y bienvenidas familias a la participación de este seminario.
This is a closer look at the practice of grading at Westhill, and right on cue, I want to make sure everyone hears our family advocate, Giselle Robolino. She has some very important information to share with you regarding translation for Spanish. Giselle.
Thank you, Mike. Buenas noches. Esta noche podrán escuchar auditivamente en vivo la opción de español.
All right, as soon as you give me the thumbs up, Olympia, good.
All
Very
set.
good. Okay, thank you. So welcome once again, everybody. We are super Westhill and proud to be able to share with you tonight the work of our grading committee at Westhill High School. However, before we take this deep dive into all things grading, first things first. There we go. First things first. Thank you, Mr. Adelspoor. So I would like to take a moment first to celebrate the incredibly impressive and equally as impressive, important work of our volunteer teacher-led committee. As Mr. Peter Rinaldi and I oversee, approve, and encourage the work of our grading committee, they are the ones that deserve all the credit in the world for helping us to move the needle, if you will, regarding this all too important subject. I would also like to take a moment to thank our Stanford Public School district leaders who continue to give us their blessing and support as well. Some of those folks on with us tonight may include Associate Superintendents Beldotti, Della Flora, and Fernandez. Also on with us this evening in support is Dr. Lori Rose. She is Stanford's new Director of Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment, specifically for secondary schools. Lastly, I would like to thank our parents for their participation and feedback as well. That began over the summer. During our summer work, we had parent representation in the work that we were doing over the summer. And to those parents who also reached out to me personally, the conversations that we had were extremely enlightening and very, very helpful, and helped us to better prepare for our presentation this evening. And we're also going to continue to ask for your participation, which you'll hear a little bit about later on when we get to questions and answers. So let's talk about the questions and answers for a moment before we go to the next slide. And that would be what we're going to ask you to do is make sure you put your questions in the chat. And when we are finished with the presentation, we will go through and answer each of those questions. If by chance, we don't believe this will be the case, but if by chance time does not allow us to answer all of your questions, they will be answered and they will be posted on the website. And so just keep in mind, you may have heard the recording starting. This is going to be entirely recorded, and it will be on our website for any time, for any parent who wants to view and listen and learn. So let's go to the next slide. So why is this work important? You have to always start with the word why. So grading policies and practices require deeper attention in order to ensure the following. One, that they provide students with skills and confidence to achieve college and career success. The work is important because grading practices need to provide students with valuable feedback and motivation to support their learning journeys as high school students. And they need to, grading practice are important for improving student learning outcomes and closing opportunity gaps. So there are very key principles of an accurate and effective grading system. And now I'm going to turn this portion over to Mr. Peter Rinaldi, who is going to take us through some of this. Pete.
Hey, everybody. Great to see everyone here. Again, thank you so much for your participation and being involved. The feedback we've gotten so far has been incredible, and I look forward to kind of collaborating as we move through this work together. So we want to start, we are operating under kind of a key set of principles that we believe constitute an accurate and effective grading system. I'm going to go through each of these principles, expand on them a little bit in the slides coming. I'm going to talk about both sort of where grading policies are now, as well as our aspirational approach, or where we'd eventually like to be regarding these key principles. So just kind of take a look here. This is an overview, and then we're going to discuss each of these in just a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides. All right, Mr. Otterspore, let's, all right, so our first principle, grades communicate learning. And in a conventional practice, grades don't always sufficiently prioritize or convey the masteries of skills and content. A lot of times, instead, they reflect a whole assortment of factors, and a lot of these factors are subjective and highly dependent on the educator. So we are aspiring towards a practice that looks like the following, okay? Grades communicate students' content mastery and skill development. Students have multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning. Grades promote transparency among students, families, and educators. So here we're trying to move towards grading systems that emphasize learning, the content that you've mastered, not necessarily the time it took to master that content, and not necessarily mixing non-academic information with information about learning. So that's where we're hoping to go here as far as what our grades communicate. Okay, principle 2, grades should not measure soft skills. So often now grades include subjective evaluations, things like behavior, participation, or professionalism. Sometimes this muddies the representation of student performance and student learning, because that becomes only one factor among many that constitutes a grade. And so we're going to aspire to a system where we prioritize social and emotional development through classroom instruction. We definitely prioritize a culture of feedback. Students develop strong habits, they develop behaviors, they develop their non-cognitive skills, but these factors are excluded from the students' grades. And it's important to emphasize here, it's not that we are saying that soft skills don't matter. Okay? They're very, very important. What we're saying is they already implicitly contribute to grades on tests and assignments. So they shouldn't be included again in the student grade. So our principle 3, grades support a culture of growth and improvement. So often now grades function as a destination rather than an indicator of progress in the learning journey for both students and educators. Grades are presented as high-level letter or tally of points earned. Sometimes this promotes disengagement from the learning process. Students don't always tie the grading process to the learning process, and that happens at all levels. So we're trying to shift to a world where grades offer timely and accessible feedback. They empower students with information around their strength and growth areas. Educators engage in regular conversations with students about their grades and with colleagues around grading practices. Essentially, we'd like to see grading shift from to being a way to provide feedback along the learning journey, giving students a chance to assess where they are and improve, rather than just having grade be what happens at the end, a summative evaluation of performance. And principle 4, grade calculations are clear and straightforward. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but often students can't easily understand, or parents, how grades are calculated, how assignments will affect their overall grades, how assignments are weighted. There's a lack of intentionality around alignment to standards. And so we are aspiring to have grading methods that are clear, they're uniform, including grading categories and weights. We want students and all other stakeholders to understand how grades are derived, and students to understand how to improve their grades. So our committee has done a lot of work in this area, especially around creating uniform categories and weights, which is a really important first step. It's just very, very important for all stakeholders to be able to understand how they're being graded, what a grade is made up of, and how a student can improve their grade. And then principle 5, grading practices and policies are consistent. So often there's a lack of comprehensive grading policies. Grade books and grading practices are highly variable and individualized, creating confusion and inconsistency for students as they go through their day. And so what we're looking to do with this work is establish grading policies and practices that are consistent across content areas, grade levels, and teachers, where educators and school systems work together to promote a coherent experience for students. So traditionally, there hasn't been a great deal of guidance around grading practices and policies. So teachers often grade the way that their mentor teacher did, or by some information they picked up along the way, or maybe from talking to a colleague in the hall. But when you put 165 of these teachers together, all drawing from different experiences to create their grading systems, what you get is grading that is often inconsistent and variable between teachers, and that's can be a confusing experience for the students. So we're working to develop a set of common best practices that are going to allow that student to have a coherent experience as far as understanding their grade as they move through their day. And so that's going to end my piece here about kind of going through our key principles that we're operating under. I'm going to turn it over next to Sean Otterspore and Mike Capriotti, who are co-chairing our grading committee, and they're going to tell you, all about the work our committee has been doing here these past months at Westhill. Take it away, Sean and Mike.
Sure. So the way we saw this is we'd like to take you a little bit on the abridged version of the journey that we went on and how we wound up where we are now. And so that begins in the before times.
Yes, before times. So good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Capriotti. I'm the math department chair. I'm the guy with the short beard. The guy with the long beard is Sean Otterspore. He's one of our science teachers and the school tech teacher who helps everybody out. So this discussion has been running for decades. I'm 42 years old. It's probably been going for 100 years. But in the before times up till now, a few years ago, we had a NEASC visit. NEASC is an agency that helps schools do self-reflections and pretty much takes a look at everything we do and compares us to other schools. And so while we were part of this NEASC process and self-reflecting, part of the work that came out of this experience was that we created school-wide rubrics. We used something called a rubric. And then also the idea of communicating better with the parents in the community about how grades are done and how we can improve consistency. Through that process, this was also the time when we adopted PowerSchool, which is a platform through which parents could now actively see the grade change from day to day, week to week in each of the students' teachers' classes. So based on the NEASC work that we did and the incoming technology and the PowerSchool platform, we found that we needed different ways to communicate our grades, better ways to be consistent with our grades. And really just the talk we're having tonight is us trying to be transparent and communicating with you some of the strategies that have been going on. Furthering this was the pandemic COVID-19 lockdown, which I'll let Sean speak to a little bit about.
Sure. And so during our initial lockdown and quarantine from school, and then the eventual hybrid DTLA that we had last year, teachers saw and experienced many changes in their grading practice as well as their classrooms. Among these was the fact that we were literally seeing into our students' homes and lives in a way that we had never done before. And we noticed that a lot of the traditional things that we would do in our classrooms didn't translate to Google Classroom in this virtual environment. And furthermore, we started to see how some of those behaviors and actions in our classrooms actually multiplied these disparities and caused our students to struggle in a way that we would have been able to fix if it was in person. And so we made all sorts of changes to accommodate for these, right? We distributed technology, Wi-Fi. We also noticed that asking students to have their cameras on or cameras off was not their response to participating in school, but their response to the noise and the privacy and some of the insecurities that they felt in their own homes. As a district, we rolled out ways of dealing with food insecurity, and the fact that students were working sometimes during the day to help support their families led many of us to lead our classes in an asynchronous manner. And so that led us to having flexible due dates, grading only the work that was turned in, and putting a much greater focus on our students' mental health. Those conversations were seen nationally and even internationally as teachers tried to respond to our students' needs. And so ultimately what we saw was that these disadvantages didn't just occur during a quarantine or during lockdown, but they're something that carries through the entirety of their educational experience based on what their home and their life is like. And so when we finally got back to regular school, as it is this year, we decided it was time to have a conversation and use our experiences and observations to start making changes that would positively impact our students. Back to click, there we go. So again, the Grading for Equity Grading Committee is co-chaired by myself and Mike. We represent science and math. We also have representatives from the English department, special ed, social studies, career technical education, and the English language learners. This is a teacher-led group. We meet bi-weekly on average, and when requested, we receive assistance from the administrators, both building and district, as well as from RISE.
So the RISE network, Sean and I began our journey a year and a half ago from a book and various other professional development. But there was a specific book that caught our interest, and we'll show you that book at the end of the presentation. But part of that started this, and the two of us talking, we grew into a community of educators. And part of this process is also helped out by the RISE network, who have a place with us and several other schools that are very much like ours. And they are educators and professionals that also help us along with this work. Part of the work that we did last year was that the teachers decided to survey the students and survey the staff about some different information. And I'm going to let Sean talk again about the student portion of this survey.
And so the student survey that we used was one that was derived from the RISE network. It's been administered at multiple schools throughout the state. And we had it translated in both English and Spanish, so students could respond in the language of their choice. And when we aggregated the data, we saw several positives. Among them, 78% of the students disagreed that the grades they received reflected how much the teacher liked them. And when I initially saw these numbers, I became aggravated until I realized it was a good thing, right? Students are able to see that the grades that they receive are based on the work they turn in and not how much we enjoy being in their presence or having conversations with them about watching movies on Netflix, that the work is what matters. We also saw areas of concern, particularly around this idea of Fs and zeros. As teachers, when we assign an F or a zero, we're seeing that as a way to show the student that we need this work from them, or something was terribly wrong and needs to be corrected. But what the students told us overwhelmingly was that when they receive zeros, they work about the same on their next assignment. And even worse, when we asked them to give us a free response word of how they felt, they used words like apathetic, angry, and less motivated to do work. And so from that information, we started to move forward with how could we use a signal to the students that we needed more work or needed correction from them in a way that would actually get us the result we wanted. And so we followed that up with questions where we asked students about grades. And if you could change a rule about grades, what would that be? And so I've just taken a selection here, but students said things like the effectiveness of missing one assignment shouldn't tear down your entire grade by so much. or that zeros are terrible because they ruin our self-esteem and motivation. Students said they would change the way grades were weighted because the impact of one assignment could have massive effects on their grades. Or they would change it to be a rule so students could redo work if they fail assignments. And last, a student suggested that perhaps we move the threshold of an A or a B, so a 75 plus could be a B in their opinion. We didn't really follow that one, but they wanted to see that students would have a better and fairer opportunity to do better. And that was our takeaway message from that. And then last, we asked students, if the world had no grades, if we threw out everything that we've done with grading, how would we know that students had learned? And they gave us answers like grades are a reflection of how much effort you put in, and that they do their work to the best of their ability to keep their parents happy. They put in a lot of effort, but when it turns out that their parents aren't impressed, they feel burnt out and give up. They promise that they'll work harder in the next quarter, but that doesn't really happen. We also saw that students said things that if the focus is on the grades, that their worth and value as a person seems tied up in the numbers that they receive in their classes. And some dreamed of a world where at the end of a class, the teacher could give them an overall summary of their potential as a student and their capabilities, separate from the numbers. In particular, this one idea that if they felt that something was wrong and they were willing to change it, they should be given the opportunity to make redos or retakes. And the ever-present dream of students everywhere that there should be no homework or classwork, and that the amount of things that we assess should be reduced in number and be more important throughout individual sections of the class. And so when students wanted to tell us, they wanted us to know that I think teachers shouldn't test students on memorizing or answering questions, but how they apply that information. And that when students and teachers have to worry about grades all the time, they lose touch with the actual material because they're focused too much on the numbers. And so we took that overall theme and trend in the student responses, and we moved forward. And so we gave a teacher survey to the faculty in May, and we found that 88% of the faculty voted to move to universal category names, and that 83% of the faculty voted 3 or higher to move to universal category weights. Both of these were seen as a first step in making grades more transparent and the math easier to understand, as well as simplifying the category names and calculations that were in use. So I'll throw that one back to Mike, I believe.
So imagine being a student and you're trying to navigate those 7 periods, which have 7 different teachers, and your mind or what you're looking at, or you're trying to figure out this map and it looks like Sudoku. Nope, it's right here, right? So you have teachers in columns, different categories of assessment going down the rows, and everybody's got a different weight to what it's worth. Pretty confusing. So in our work at Westhill, we're trying to make this more uniform, more consistent through the whole school, not just by teacher. And so before, you had 277 different categories amongst our entire faculty. That's a lot of different categories. And so when we did our survey of the staff and we had a lot of different conversations, what ended up coming out of our work was that people really felt there's only 2 categories. There's what we call formative assessment, and there's what we call summative assessment. And those 277 different categories pretty much fill into those 2. When you talk about redefining categories and weights, the categories before, teachers created all of their own categories and all their own weights. Now you're looking at department coordination for weighting and 2 categories by the school. So our 2 categories, they fall as formative and summative. And basically, the formative category is teacher assessing during the learning process, assessing how you learn, taking little peeks at what you're learning while you learn. And those formative assessments could be in the form of homework, daily quizzes, could be almost anything. And so where we had 277 categories, now you have a lot of names, and they're either going to fall into formative or summative. Summative, on the other hand, might be the evaluation the teacher gives after a group of lessons have been taught, or after a unit has been taught, right? What has the student learned from this? What has the student retained? That would be a summative assessment. Typically, summative assessments could be quizzes, they could be tests. Tests are the big one there. And so here is a peek at a grading continuum. Now, what I want to get straight is this isn't anything that's new. This has been around for years and years and years, probably as long as the grading conversation. But as parents, the part that we see is the traditional grading scale. You see points out of points or percentages of the whole. And that's how we've ever known what a grade is. That grade oftentimes is transformed on the report card as a letter, A through F. And those letters correspond to bins or strata within the 100-point scale. But you'll also see rubric scoring, and that gives feedback to students, which is something that's lacking in traditional grading. You know, I score an 87% on assessment. What's the feedback there? I got an 87%, that's all I know. Whereas a rubric has defined feedback for each of these categories, and it lets the student know how correct or how incorrect responses are. And ultimately, when you take a test, something with like 25 questions, where each question is worth 4 points, basically every question could be applied to a standard. That standard gets a rank by rubric 4 through 0. So standards-based grading, rubric scoring, letter grading have all been in the background while all you guys have ever seen is traditional grading.
All right, so we're going to throw it back to Mr. Peter Rinaldi so he can take you through the current Westhill grade scale.
In regards to the grading continuum, I want to just talk to you all a little bit on this slide about some of the practices that our teachers have been piloting along that continuum to sort of move us from the left side, where it's the traditional numeric scale, towards the right side, which is where we're using standard-based learning and rubrics. So some of our teachers have begun to use letter grading in place of traditional numeric scales, the second block, if you're thinking back to that picture, in order to represent student learning. So the first question, there we go. So letter grading scale. We're talking about the second block now. It's kind of a pilot area for some of our teachers. Flip back, Mr. Otterspore. So the first question might be, well, why would we do this? Why is this better for students to use these letter grades rather than these numeric grades? And remember that we're trying to make grading more simple. We're trying to have grading better communicate to students their learning, and we're trying to make grades more consistent among teachers. And the traditional 100-point scale has 101 gradations of student performance. And that's probably more than we need to accurately describe student learning. I think someone would be hard pressed to describe the difference in content mastery and learning between a student who receives a score of 78 and one who receives a score of 79. By using letters rather than numbers, we're using a more accurate scale in terms of communicating student learning. And that's going to also reduce some of the inconsistency between teachers. If you think of a real life example, if everyone on this call, if we were all standing in a room and I asked everyone to estimate how long that room was in feet, okay, we would probably have a variety of guesses and there would be some variance there, but we would probably be pretty close to one another. However, if I did the same exercise and I put us all in a room and I asked everyone to estimate the length of the room in inches, okay, I think that you would find that our variance and our numbers and our estimations would be much more divergent than if I use feet. And why is that? Did we all become all of a sudden less adept at estimating a room? We didn't. We were just using the wrong scale. We were using a scale that was inappropriate for estimating what we were looking at. And using the numeric scale is kind of like that. It's a scale that really has too many gradations to make an estimation of something like student learning. So we believe by reducing the number of gradations that we're using to assess learning, okay, we're going to give the students a more accurate picture of where they are. So if we just take a look at this table, let's just orient ourselves to the table here. We can see on the left the traditional grade point scale, but it's organized into groups of points, 83 to 86, 87 to 89, 90 to 92, etc. And what we're asserting is that any grade within that range really represents the same level of mastery. And so we're giving a single letter grade to convey to the student what their level of performance is. So for example, let's just look at the B grade level. It's right there in the middle, okay? What we're really saying here is that range is 83 to 86. In reality, 83, 84, 85, and 86 really represent a very similar, identical level of mastery. It's very hard to peel apart within that range, different levels of mastery. So we're going to take any of those numeric values that fall within that range, 83, 84, 85, 86, and we're going to assign that a grade of B, conveying a good level of mastery to the student, some area to improve, but generally meeting content standards. That B will ultimately go into Power School as a percent value of 85, so it cuts just about down the middle. Okay. And so what we believe is that overall, grading like this is going to be more accurate. It's going to give more accurate information to the students, and it's going to allow teachers to be more consistent in the way that they assign grades to students. And the next slide, Mr. Otterspoor. So I think Mr. Capriati already alluded to this, but some of our upcoming work is going to involve looking to move along this continuum, looking for ways to provide more specific and actionable feedback to students as they complete their learning journey through the course. Both rubrics and standard-based grading involve measuring student proficiency against specific content standards within a course. Rather than just getting a single grade that's kind of everything lumped together, it doesn't necessarily always inform the student of which parts of the course they learned really well and which they might need to improve on. So when we use a rubric or standards-based grading, we more clearly communicate learning, we make grades more meaningful, we allow students to work at their own pace towards mastery, working only on the areas that they still need to improve and no longer on the concepts that the standards they've already mastered. We have teachers using these tools regularly in classrooms, but we're looking towards more widespread adoption, as well as a continuing examining of our grading policies just to move from the conventional approach towards the aspirational approach that was outlined in the slides at the beginning of the presentation. And one more, Mr. Otterspoor. And so we'd be remiss if we didn't point out that much of the work, principles and philosophy that guide this committee come from the work of Joe Feldman, who's an established author on this subject. So one of the main texts we use to guide this work is Grading for Equity. So that's a book that you can pick up and read if you're interested to really dive deep on this and know more about some of the principles and research and other information that is guiding our work here at Westhill. And then at this point, I'm going to throw it back to Mr. Rinaldi, Principal Mr. Rinaldi.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Michael. So that concludes the formal presentation for the evening, but now what we would like to do is go into, there were two areas that folks started to put their questions in. So I'm going to go to the chat first. That was the first one I saw. Here we go. Okay. So I'm just going in order, folks. And here we go. So the first question, and I won't mention parents' names for no other reason except some folks are anonymous. So we'll just go with the questions. The first question that I see is, why is there no A+? Anyone like to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure, I will. We are working within the confines of, I guess, the established grading systems that are district-based or district policy. And so we've never had an A+ for whatever reason within our grading system, nor is it in our handbook or any other policy. So, we haven't necessarily entertained adding an A+, but I think that the reason you don't see it now is because this is the standard set of grades that we use per BOE policy, and that doesn't include it in A+. But if it ever were, then we would include it in this work as well.
Thank you, Pete. Next question is, how will these changes affect students' GPA? How does this compare to other districts in Fairfield? And what is the impact on college application competitiveness? That's a three-parter, and Michael or Sean or both.
Sure. So I can certainly speak to the GPA part since I spend a lot of time in Power School assisting teachers. One of the interesting facts about the way Power School works is that when teachers enter numbers for an assignment, say they get a 15 out of a 15 on a lab, that grade is converted into a percentage. It's also converted into a letter for display on the website. Ultimately, what happens is the letter that is issued for the quarter or the course is what is factored into the GPA. So though you may receive an 84.51 as your final average in a course, that grade was always converted to a B, which was always converted to a 3 on the GPA scale. And so that GPA lookup still occurs straight across the board. We're just in some cases skipping the step. If a teacher is using letter grading, they're skipping the step of converting from a number to a letter, and they're just going straight to the letter.
Thank you. I'll just mention that with regard to other districts in Fairfield County, where we are exploring some of that, we are also, as we mentioned before, part of the RISE network. So we are, we're in the cohort 2. How many total schools, people, you know? We're
around 8 schools, I believe.
8 schools. So part of what we'll be able to figure out, the different schools are at different points in this process in the group that we're in. So we'll be able to get some of that information. And we're going to have other meetings going forward as well. So we'll hopefully have a better answer with regard to other districts. Next question in the chat. I'm sorry, the other, well, I think Sean kind of answered the rest of that one now. So next question, every other range is within 3 points and have plus and minus. A is now 7-point range and no plus option. What is the rationale? I think Peter answered that question with regard to the A+. If not, I'm sorry, but I think we did. Next question, has this been implemented and explained to students? Yes, it has been. One of the things, so, super full transparency. And, all the credit for all the good work being done goes to the committee, especially to Sean and Mike, and anything that isn't where we wanted to be, exactly where we wanted to be, is going to fall to me as the principal. And one of the things that we are now circling back around and helping the teachers in the committee do a better job of is explaining exactly what this process is and what is different for students. What we also know is no matter what our students hear in school from teachers, even if teachers have the correct language to be able to explain what we're piloting, what we're doing differently, they may go home and that's going to be something that's going to be lost in translation too. And so that's why it's really important for us to have this presentation this evening with you and continue the conversation going forward, which we're going to talk about before we close out. There is another question about GPA, which I think Mr. Otterspoor answered.
I'll step in just if
Yep.
I'm looking at the same question there. So there was a question, if GPA is calculated by numbers, like a 3.45, how will this affect student ranking? So when you see a student who has a GPA like a 3.45, it's because that is an average calculation of their GPA across their courses, as well as any weighting that they may have received from honors or AP classes. So again, giving a student a B and them earning a 3 for their GPA in your course is the way it's always been. And that GPA will average in with all the rest of them following the school calculations.
And I
Thank
would just
you.
add there, this does not affect the weighting as far as the weighting of honors and AP classes. This is entirely separate from that. So when if you're not familiar, in honors class, you get an additional weight of 0.05, and an AP class, you get an additional weight of 0.07 in your GPA, and both of those are unaffected by any of these pilot practices.
So speaking of AP, there was a question, as I believe the question is meant to ask, are any of the teachers in the that are piloting some of this teaching AP classes?
So I can speak to AP a little bit. At the end of an AP, you take an AP exam, and ultimately you receive a rank on that exam of 1 through 5. Those ranks are your mastery of that material. 1 is an F, 2 is a D, 3 is a C, 4 is a B, 5 is an A. Those also correlate to our ranking of rubrics from 0 through 4, except everything got moved up 1 point on the AP exam and the AP ranking. AP exams are also graded by rubric for the free response questions, so the students are used to using rubrics and understand how they work.
Thank you, Mike. And to the question as to whether or not any of the teachers in the pilot are using some of these new or establishing some of these new grading practices, are they teaching AP? Anybody teaching AP and doing it?
I
There
am.
you go. I was waiting. That's what I was waiting for. Good man. Thank you. All right. Next question is where do we find the GPA calculation details on the school website?
Yes, so GPA calculations are listed both in the handbook as well as BOE policy. And if you go to the school counselor section of the website, there are the GPA lookup tables as well.
Thank you. All right. So that, I believe that concludes all the questions in the chat. I'm going to go over to the other section here where it's the question and answer tab. So the first one says, that's not true. I see all of the above mentioned grading, the traditional, the rubric, and the standard-based learning. So I'm not I don't know what, I'm sorry.
I
but
wonder, possibly it's pointed to that it is true that we have all of the above mentioned grading at Westhill. And that is part of the issue with having students have a coherent experience. So yeah, we do have teachers grading in a very traditional way. We have teachers and departments using rubrics, and then we do have some teachers using standards-based learning as well. So we have teachers sort of all throughout the grading curriculum here at Westhill.
Thank you, Pete.
That's
And
what
if
the
that
question is getting at.
thank you. And if that didn't answer the question for you, we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask it again. We didn't answer that. And so we'll talk about that in a few moments. I just want to get through all these questions. Next question is, how does this affect GPA? I think we've addressed that a bit. Let's go to the next one. In the example of students who admitted they wouldn't try harder if they received a 0, how will it motivate a student to do better than just shooting for a 90 or 80 or 70 if that effort is equal to a 96, an 89 or 79? How is that equitable to a student whose performance level represents higher mastery? Because I'll answer or try to answer the first part of that question, in that I've taught for a long time and I've been an administrator for a long time. When students receive 0s or very low Fs, and quite honestly, that happens sometimes too with students who typically achieve at a higher level, it pulls down the student's overall grade more than it should when you're trying to average all of the other assessments and opportunities students have to show mastery of their learning. In some cases, that 0 negatively affects the student's self-esteem as a learner. And in the worst case scenario, some students find that no matter how hard they try because of, say, a 20 or a 30, they happen to bomb an assessment, they know no matter how hard they work, once they do the math, that they won't be able to get back up to where they know they can be, where they can demonstrate mastery of a particular subject or topic or concept. So Sean, do you want to take the next part of that, Sean or Mike?
Sure. So again, if we're referring to using letter-based grading, the letters have an assigned value in PowerSchool. So a B is an 85. So a student scoring in the B range would receive that letter grade on their report card or transcript in either situation, whether a student is a teacher is trying the new grading system or if they are following traditional scoring. And so the question is whether a student would be less motivated to try for the next level of points based on that sort of center median score. In part, what we are representing by using the letters, those teachers who are, is we're using it to differentiate ourselves from the teachers who are using traditional grading. So by using letters in my class, I teach forensics and biology, by using those letters on assignments in my classroom, I'm signaling to the students that this is being graded in a way different from how you've traditionally been graded. And therefore, I want them to look at the rubric, or I want them to look at the scoring criteria or the standards. When I grade their test, in my case, I happen to grade out of points for the test that they just took. In that case, it was multiple choice. And so it was not a new and improved test that was based on standards. So in some cases, if you see teachers who are issuing letters on assignments, they're doing it on purpose as a signal to the students and parents that they are trying different methods or techniques. But mathematically, a B is a B as far as the transcript is concerned, because it always aggregates down into those letter buckets. And while I'm on the idea of letters, the question again about A+, Westhill has never had an A+. We have no way of giving your student a grade any higher than A. I can give them 115 points as their final average, and they only receive an A because that's as high as we go.
Thank you, Sean. So
I
next
just
question.
add,
Sorry, Pete.
I'm sorry, can I just add here, because I want to make an important distinction that perhaps this question is getting at. So early on in the pilot, we did have some teachers not using plus minus grading. So they were using A, B, C, D, F, again, in an effort to try and simplify the process. And so that would describe a case that's being talked about in this question, where like an 80 would be equal to an 89, and how is that motivational? But we received a lot of valuable parent feedback around that, and there were some really valid points around having buckets that were that big. And in response to that, we've shrunk our buckets. So you would see in the slide I showed that we are now going to use plus minus grading. So we're aligned in the same exact scale that's used throughout Westhill. So we would only be giving equivalent grades for a much smaller range of numbers. So for instance, a B+ would just be like your 88 and 89. So those two would be differentiated from what was previously a much wider range in some classes, where everybody between 80 and 89 was getting the grade of B. And I think parents rightfully so brought up to us that maybe that bucket was just a little bit too big. And so we have made that change to our policies.
Thanks, Pete. So next question is this a Westhill initiative or a BOE initiative? So it is definitely a Westhill initiative, but with the support and encouragement of our central office administrators and team. So that's the answer to that. Why weren't parents surveyed? What if parents disagree? So if you remember when Sean and Michael were giving the history around some of the work we were doing, it was happening during the first part of the school closure when we all went out in March of 2019, and then during some of the hybrid. We didn't survey parents, and to be honest, regarding certain things we want to try in class or anything else, we don't necessarily survey parents, but we are hoping to be able to engage you now going forward in the work. And as Peter just mentioned too, some of the feedback received in the last couple of weeks helped us to take a different look at some of the things we were doing and Peter described it as the bucket was too small and we needed to, or too wide rather, and we needed to tighten up on that. So the feedback that we receive from parents is very important. And if parents disagree, certainly with anything, not just grading for equity, they certainly can email me directly if they like, or Mr. Otterspor or Capriati. Although the more efficient way to do this, we're going to talk about in a moment. We're going to create a Google form for a continued conversation. So I don't want to get ahead of myself there. So is this a district-wide grading method? Or okay, so that was the same question I just kind of answered. What does the A97 really mean? If a student gets a perfect score, isn't that a bad message? Sean or Mike on that one?
So my explanation to my students is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it is the more Zen answer, which is there is no perfection, only the striving for perfection, which is appropriate when we talk about formative assessments. So during the learning, during the unit, during the chapter, when I'm grading assignments based on letters, what I'm trying to convey to the students is where are they and the continuum of understanding. So if their ability to roll a fingerprint, identify the minutia, and confirm a match is in the A range, that means they're exhibiting excellent work. If it's in the B range, it means they're doing good work, but there's some room for improvement. And on that assignment, that lab, I would circle and otherwise annotate or feed back to my students where it is that they need to improve. Same for C, same for D, and then eventually for F, it would be the same. So maybe the work was missing, done entirely wrong, which is possible in science, or in need of massive improvement. In all of those cases, what the students need to do then is either make the repair on their own or meet with me, converse with me, or otherwise interact with their classmates to find the missing information, the missing skills, and make that repair, which again is somewhat what we're trying to represent for those of us who are using letters, is that the final grade that you received on that paper may not be the final grade, right? That is the work in progress grade, and we want you now to engage with us. And so that's the big takeaway that we had from COVID, which was the work that we receive is a work in progress, and we were much more willing to continuously work with students within reason based on the number of classes and time, but that students could continuously engage with the material to eventually show and prove that they've reached mastery.
Thank you, Sean. Next question is, if this is a pilot, what is the success criteria to confirm this is working? I'll take that in that it is a pilot. And when we began in our very baby steps last spring or second semester, and then more so into the spring, some of the data that we shared earlier was certainly encouraging enough that we should continue. We had the student survey, we had student learning outcomes, albeit, in COVID, more challenging COVID times. And we had the conversation and survey with teachers. So all of that data is what gave us the confidence to move forward that this was definitely worth continuing to explore. And so the next question is, can you please explain what this process actually looks like, how it will change the current grading policies? Please include specific examples. So to the first part of that question, and again, if this is not answering your question, we'll try again when we go back and look at all the questions in the chat and try to do a better job. But I think we did a pretty thorough job of explaining where we were, how we got to where we are, and what the process is now. And so maybe if you go back through this, you look at it again, you look at the beginning, that might help. And if it doesn't, we'll try to do a better job in answering that part of your question. How will it change the current grading policy? So if you're referring to district policies, the answer is, I don't know. We got to see where it goes. And I've said more than once to the committee and to our central office personnel who are supporting this work that eventually it becomes a larger conversation. And so that is something that we're going to be working on going forward with our central office folks. Peter?
I would just add that I think we're in compliance. So policies are very limited around grading, but the policies that we do have simply state that there must be weighting for honors and AP classes, the 0.05 and the 0.07, which this doesn't affect, and that the grades issued are as per that scale I showed you, which is that we are using A minus, B plus, B minus, et cetera. So those are the two policy pieces from the BOE. Obviously, we're striving to have some practices that strive for a lot more, but we're in, this doesn't affect or is not out of compliance with those policies at all.
Thank you, Pete. And so the next question is, will last year's grades be recalculated? The answer to that is no. They would never be, and certainly not because of the work of the grading committee. So the answer to that question is no. Yes, we are recording this entire presentation. It will be on our website. And once it's on the website, anybody will be able to see it, certainly. So wait for that, and we'll have that up in a couple of days. There's a question about honors and AP classes, and we did speak about that. If you missed that, if you re-watch, you'll see some conversation around honors and APs. No worry. Oh, you did. I don't know. That's not the same person. So someone wrote, sorry, I missed the beginning. Will this affect seniors? Affects, there are some seniors who are part of the pilot, if that's what you're referring to. The answer would be yes, if I understood your question correctly. Here's another question about GPA, but GPA is calculated by numbers like 3.45. Also, how does this affect student ranking in their class? I'll throw that to Michael or Sean.
So I think the important thing to recognize is that teachers have always graded their classes the way they saw most appropriate and best for their students. And so in some classes, you had teachers who allowed makeups, you had teachers who dropped the lowest test score or lowest quiz grade, you had teachers who allowed for extra credit, others who didn't. And so all of those are acceptable behaviors by teachers. They've been done classically. And it was part of the game of school for students to figure out what the rules were for each classroom. And so our work that we're doing here is looking at simplifying and coordinating those rules between classes and departments, and then ultimately around the building, so that the rules are less challenging and more straightforward. Ultimately, the grade received in the class or grade received on the paper is the same assessment of that student's learning that was always taking place. It's just sometimes being conveyed in a different manner, using the letter B+ instead of writing 89 on the paper. But ultimately, those calculations will be putting students into the same letters that they've always had. And as members of the pilot, as teachers who are trying different aspects of this, because I'm looking at some of the other questions that are on the side here, we are also keeping track, right? So traditionally what would happen is at the end of the quarter, teachers would look at their grades, and sometimes they'd nod and say, this is good work. And other times they'd say, how come these students' grades are a little bit lower than I'd like them to be? And that's when we, in the math side of things, would just add some points here and there. We diminish in a particular assignment in a way to sort of adjust the grade to where we felt it should be. As a committee, we are trying to move away from that process of adjusting grades and making it so the grading process itself is more fair and clear, so that it doesn't necessitate an adjustment at the end. And then ultimately that will benefit students, parents, and teachers because there will be less manipulation of grades and more grading that is straightforward.
Thank you, Sean. And so we now come up to just about an hour. And so I want to certainly be respectful of everyone's time on the call tonight. And we anticipated certainly that this could go on longer, or certainly we anticipated there would be questions we wouldn't necessarily be able to get to. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to answer each and every question in the chat or in the question and answer tab. We're going to create a Google form that will be, Sean, why don't you explain how we're going to put that up so that parents will know that their questions are being answered, and then the continued conversation going forward with the work.
Absolutely. So on the school website, we'll put up a dedicated page in reference to grading, and the Google form will be created to allow people to submit additional questions or ask for clarification. That way it will come to the group of us and we'll have a record of those so we can not lose them in email. And then we'll post responses in publicly available documents that will also be linked on that page, along with this recording and the slideshow.
And thank you, Sean. And I really want to make sure that parents hear from me specifically that your questions and your involvement and your concerns are heard. We definitely get it. It's definitely what we're doing is definitely different than what we all kind of grew up in traditionally. And so the conversation will continue. I would really like though to emphasize that it's important to send your questions into the form that will be on the website, because that will also be part of the work the committee will be handling when they get together and able to work together. So we have to make sure that the questions are in the form that will be on the website, because that's the only way we can be really confident that we'll be able to answer all of your questions and continue the conversation. Okay, so emails are a part of everybody's life, but emails are not the place for questions. It'll be the form. Okay, and so that concludes our presentation, but certainly doesn't conclude the work ahead. Our collaboration with our central office folks and our collaboration with all of you. This is heavy stuff. This is a lot, but it's super, super important work. We really appreciate you being on the call tonight, and give us a few days. We're not going to have the questions answered by tomorrow morning, but we will work to get those answered for you and continue, and then we will continue the conversation going forward. So thank you very, very much for joining us this evening, and I hope everyone has a wonderful night. Thank you. Bye-bye.